Climbers' fascination with beauty, particularly that on the top of mountains, originates from the way in which the pursuit of such beauty is highly regarded by its people, elevating it beyond a simple human desire to a fundamental necessity that must be captured. Seeing the mountain's beauty acts as the closest possibility of near self-transcendence. This alone justifies a climber's need to exceed past their limit and tribulations that befall on their journey, for it is all banked on the opportunity to be a witness or a part of something so extraordinary that using words to describe it would almost be a disservice to how magnificent it is, in contrast to actually experiencing said beauty in real time. Though this yearning tends to be isolating from a person's societal norms or expectations and muddies the waters of why a person would decide to start mountain climbing from a non-climber's perspective, for those entranced, it calls with such a booming, almost angelical voice that it forces them to believe that not being able to bear witness to this beauty is a sin against their values and efforts, and is a necessity in order to move forward in their respective lives, even if it's one that could only be witnessed at a distance. However, to those that have decided to pursue this beauty regardless of its course or how fleeting it is, in order to feed into this obsessive itch, there also remains a darker side of pursuing this beauty, ends up with some people biting more than they can chew, especially when it gets to a point where the obsession turns into an all-consuming wildfire that can't be extinguished, causing climbers to make decisions that would be deemed as reckless and irresponsible from even other climbers, but from the ones truly obsessed is seen as a necessity in order to achieve their goal and satisfy their thirst for absolute beauty. The beauty of the mountains can only be revealed when it is pursued, though it could also reveal the more negative side of itself when those who are consumed by it seek the mountains as a means to escape the fears, thoughts, and problems that constantly occupy their minds. Consequently, someone is forced to confront their values and repressed self, discovering where true beauty really lies. And as such, a newfound perspective onto beauty and life itself is discovered, even if it's found within the things that people were incredibly adamant in avoiding. And the main character of the climber is an accurate representation of such change. For a majority of his life, Mori Buntaro's growing fascination with the mountains has led him to a path surrounded by long stretches of isolation and consistency, which is put in place all in order for him to continue climbing, for he shared a love with the mountain's beauty that was synonymous with past climbers. In fact, climbing mountains was something that seemed almost destined to happen due to his dedication and apparently natural affinity towards it as well. While his knowledge and admiration for climbing mountains is not impossible to come by for someone of his age, it is exceedingly rare nonetheless. However, it's this exact same rarity and this growing fascination later turned obsession creates a barrier between him and the world, and though it's never explicitly stated whether his decision to turn his back on society was something that happened before or after he started mountain climbing, what is known is that for Mori, one of the major beauty/benefits that came with mountain climbing was that it allowed him to achieve a harmonious, peaceful state of mind that could never be dreamed of being replicated. At the time, he felt forced to live in a society where he felt no attachment to anyone or anything, being continuously stunted in a world that allowed him to exist within his societal confines, but hardly seemed accepting of him wanting to live out his desires of climbing mountains, thus denying his existence entirely. This harsh ugliness of discrimination and scrutiny that followed him in his past and present made the aspect of climbing mountains much more alluring and harder to ignore, for the mountains could not only be treated as the only safe haven for Mori to gain peace for himself, but it gives him a new leash of hope and being properly understood, and understanding that his desire of isolation and possessing an ironclad focus on his goals are so strong and an absolute necessity, and a hope that his life has purpose and is worth living for, even if it's for fulfilling a specific purpose that won't make sense to anyone else but him alone. The compulsion to find tranquility spurred him. Reaching a mountain summit, the vast sky unveiled unknown beauty, its raw magnitude almost transcending existence, and due to this, he felt a huge sense of accomplishment rewarded by his efforts. Mori seemed grateful for the mountains for teaching him that his solitude and by extension, his societal deemed flaws weren't really flaws at all once averted to another perspective. And as such, he felt a duty to accept the mountains by climbing them, regardless of how close it seemed to have him gazing at death's door. In order to gaze at greater beauties that lied beyond, for it seemed to be the least that he could do. While the mountains appear gracious towards a loner like Mori, that is not always the case for everyone who decides to climb them with the necessary skill set and mindset needed. Despite its outward magnetic charm, at its core, the mountains and by extension nature is an unrelenting, unfeeling aspect of the world that bends to no man's will or imperfections, and that also hardly holds much forgiveness for the tiniest human errors, no matter how one is about climbing them. And the stakes of that danger increase tenfold if one is climbing with other people. As a character Mitsumi Kurosawa bluntly states it, the mountain's philosophy, or rather the act of climbing them, is one that is centered around individualism and a need for self-awareness of having to constantly brush with a climber's morality. And thus the mountain doesn't owe their lives to anyone. Rather, we give up our lives to them. If you want to save somebody, save yourself. Those who meet the demand of perfectionism at the skill doesn't always guarantee a fair trade to the efforts that climbers make. For in the blink of an eye, some minor change can happen towards the weather that can make the mountains rear its ugly half towards its unexpected bystanders who've longed to view the same beauty that beckons them, and to those who've decided to march to the beat of their own drums also. However, those who have escaped the wrath of the mountains are not safe from its long-term effects, as descending into society again changes them mentally, effectively rewiring their sense of morale. Oftentimes, symptoms of survivor's guilt can arise for having to witness or indirectly be a part of the traumatic experience of the death of loved ones that lingers on. And as such, this prompts a question: is it possible for the beauty that is found on the surface to completely mask the ugliness that exists underneath, enduring the possibility of permanent scars of death, regardless of whether their efforts will succeed? Although he had not thought of weighing himself with these thoughts and questions previously, they come to permeate Mori's mind when his relationship with people and the mountains start to change and intertwine with each other. Mori's embrace of isolation arises from not only his belief that it's essential for achieving his goals, but also from its integration into his self-identity. However, his need for isolation being a natural aspect of his character is challenged when reoccurring incidents from his school days come to light, revealing instances where he was the center of blame for harm inflicted on others. Consequently, the bearing of the weight of these past transgressions, regardless of his actual culpability, provides him with a justification for his solitude, allowing him to avoid confronting the guilt and complexities of his past and present. In those moments where he felt confused, afraid, and powerless for not being able to change the outcome of those separate situations. Furthermore, in not confronting his past, he would have had to confront the kind of person he'd become and the self-imposed ideals he would have portrayed if he had indulged in making connections that, while seemingly beneficial, often robbed him of his humanity, often leaving him feeling like a dead man walking. Ironically though, at least in my eyes, Mori ends up revealing more sides about himself that relate to his relationship with other people during his stretches of isolation. For an outsider, Mori's mountain obsession is a blinding force, making him unobservant, and therefore people often look down on him. This statement captures my attention because it captures the essence of Mori's past, because his decision to climb mountains stemmed from a desire to always look forward and not at the society below and the person who he was. Although the mountains make him keen and observant to a part of the world that people rarely see in their lives, he's as blind as a bat towards most of the happenstances towards others, and when people take notice of this, they form a perception of him that's based on what they see, and it's in these perceptions that others form that makes it difficult for Mori to exist in a reality, or rather it's difficult for Mori to bring forth a more clear perception that people should have of the complexities that lie within him. However, to his surprise, as he meets people who are like-minded and driven to climb the same mountains as he'd want to, especially people as passionate towards the same beauty he's enamored by, he slowly begins to build a sense of attachment and trust that initially feels alienating and bizarre, but eventually dissipates into comfort, because now truly feeling like a part of a group not only gives him the much needed motivation to bridge the gap between him and other people, but it also gives him the courage to regain a trust and faith in the judgment of others that was so flooded by years worth of piling distrust, which caused him to avert his eyes for an aspect of humanity that initially felt worth fighting and challenging himself for, thanks to the influence of those in his group, especially people like Nimi Taku, who not only shared a similar fixation with the beauty of the mountains, willing to do anything in order to achieve his goals, and who also shared the desire to be accepted and understood by others due to him experiencing years of ostracization. He's able to gain an unexpected re-evaluation/understanding of himself that wouldn't have been possible had he remained in solitude, that also forced him to disregard his day to be forever purged in isolation, which seemed to be an irrefutable facet about himself that he wouldn't have needed to face otherwise. However, as this facet of himself begins to disappear, the mountain stubbornly remains its same harsh demeanor, and as if in a fit of rage for Mori for breaking his promise and trust for no longer being his ideal self that benefited him greatly, punishes him with the weight of those same lost lives he gained an appreciation for, were lost in its wake, that only gains life when semblances of pain and agony adhere in his soul. This tragedy of loss cuts deeper when Mori gets dealt with a betrayal in the hands of a classmate named Hajime Miyamoto, someone who he considered to be a friend even in his droughts of isolation. While they both had drastically contrasting personalities, within them was a shared commonality in wanting to bear witness to the beauties of the top of the mountains that deeply mattered to both. And this is something that Mori clearly cherished. The thought of him, even after so much time and hurt, temporarily caused a warmth to bloom in his heart as he reminisced on the memories that they both shared in their younger days, and momentarily it released a tension and thin smile on his lips that seemed impossible to bear witness to previously, which allows for a beautiful moment of nostalgia and connection to wash over him, which only makes the disgraceful acts even more heart-wrenching for him. Following this act of betrayal, Mori is pulled into a terrible loop of isolation and anguish, and although he had almost escaped it, he feels an overwhelming urge to return to this state in order to survive, to avoid emotional pain and the painful consequences of betraying his former ideals. He retreats into a familiar dark mindset that's somewhat comforting. Once again, he finds humans, or rather connections, burdensome and resents how he is forced to navigate and act through this world's ugliness and interconnected that lies underneath and above the mountains. Despite him initially putting behind any hope of mending his relationship with people and the world at large, a new form of empathy, understanding and purpose is injected into Mori's heart when he forms a connection with Kato, a university researcher whom he shared a university with, and as their relationship progresses, a significant transformation begins to occur. In a calm, intimate moment they share, changing the trajectory of each other's lives. Shared his words to Hana by just saying that she should go to wherever interests her, which probably felt like common, run-of-the-mill words of advice to him. But to her, they were words dripping with a powerful source of inspiration and self-validation that she desperately yearned for. Due to years of her being ostracized and being perceived as abnormal for her identity, and having an interest in facets of the world that others would hardly turn an eye to, or rather than properly understand. As such, she expresses words of gratitude and realization towards Mori, and they strike with such impact to his heart due to them reminding him of how he was not alone in harboring these lifelong emotions, and in how he was perceived by a majority of people that he came across that plagued him mentally. His and Hannah's shared experience in loneliness reminds him that this feeling of validation and acceptance is that he yearned for in a human being, and especially in himself, is something that he desperately needed. Not only does this moment revitalize his hope in making connections and being at peace with himself, but it allows him to internalize that he is worth living for another person, and opens his eyes to another perspective, to a form of beauty in other people. As such, This is the first act of self-love that Mori gives towards himself. The true magnitude of how impactful this scene is best explained in an excerpt of a video titled In Search of Absolute Beauty by a YouTuber named Like Stories of Old. In that one of the most important aspects of experiencing absolute beauty is of experiencing validation and affirmation, and of having what's inside of us acknowledged and given back to us. Though he's able to find beauty and value in his life, more specifically in one that is shared with his now wife Hannah and their child Ruka, one that doesn't revolve solely around mountains, Mori still isn't able to completely walk away from his compulsive need to climb again, even if he isn't actively searching for an opportunity to do so, as it seems to be a fated part of his existence that can't be ignored due to how he's influenced other people, and as he is entrenched in arguably his most dangerous tango of climbing a mountain. Reaching the summit of K2 leads to a mirage of internal conflicts that he is forced to confront once again, regarding what the type of person Mori was in the past and in the present, the beauty he found in the past and the beauty that he now finds in the present. As mentioned earlier, it was within climbing mountains, no matter how dangerous or life-threatening they were, that he was able to experience a form of validation, affirmation, and purpose for his entire self that was not provided to him in his earlier younger years. However, those wants and needs have now been reinstated and rediscovered towards his family and colleagues, and now he's able to live for himself and others in non-self-destructive ways, something that the mountains wasn't proficient in teaching him. But being exposed to the mountains, that first thing that engulfed his entire existence, his individuality, and reawakened that same carnivorous desire for more of the beauty that was impossible to ignore, ends up with him wrestling with his individuality, or rather his perception of how he's meant to be at this moment, with his perception of beauty being so intertwined that his mind is warped into two. Should he solely live out the rest of his days carving his legacy as Mori, the immortal Bunturo, or as Mori Bunturo, the husband and father? It is nearing the ending of the climber where its stance on absolute beauty is made clear and is beautifully conveyed in its concluding chapter. Now having finally conquered the summit of K2, the hardest/highest mountain he's ever climbed before, within an inch of his life, Mori still feels a desire to climb, but is no longer controlled by the obsession of having to center his existence towards climbing anymore. Now no longer having to be engulfed by a darker side of beauty that was used as a form of escapism for his fears, pains, and thoughts. And as such, he does not need beauty as an excuse to run away anymore. Now choosing to center his eyes towards his family. Now being able to, or striving to find a balance between the two, and now confidently aware of which source of beauty is more important, no longer needed to be solely validated by a singular source of the world, as he's already accepted and yearned for by a certain part of the world that helps him to grow in ways that he needed to. But most importantly, now he is in a state of absolute beauty, in which he could embrace and be embraced, touch and be touched, to be enveloped in light and shining